Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from Smith School of Business. My name is Meredith Dault, and I'm a business journalist at Smith School of Business here at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And I'm your host for today's webinar on understanding Indigenous economic reconciliation. And we'll be exploring what businesses can do to better provide opportunities for economic inclusion and partnership. Today's webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and the Institute for Sustainable Finance at the Smith School of Business. To begin, let's acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. To acknowledge this territory is to recognize its longer history, one predating the establishment of the earliest European colonies. It's also to acknowledge this territory's significance for the Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live upon it, and whose practices and spiritualities were tied to the land and continue to develop in relationship to the territory and its other inhabitants today. A few housekeeping items before we get started. I want to remind you, as I always do, that this hour-long discussion will be recorded. You'll be getting a link to that recording by email in a couple of days, and I want to encourage you to share it among your friends and colleagues and within your network. Finally, I really hope that you will take the opportunity today to ask a question. To do that, I will ask you to use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. So we'll be getting to questions in the second part of today's presentation. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Hillary Thatcher, Managing Director of Indigenous and Northern Infrastructure with Canada Infrastructure Bank. Hillary's team is responsible for offering advice and making investments consistent with Canada Infrastructure Bank's priority initiatives with and for the benefit of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. Before joining the Canada Infrastructure Bank, Hillary spent 20 years with the federal government and the Ontario government in senior roles across Indigenous Services Canada, Energy and Infrastructure, and Natural Resources. Hillary has Métis ancestry and enjoys volunteering on the boards of directors for Red Sky Performance and the Downey Wenjack Fund, with both organizations working to enhance reconciliation and education through the arts. Hillary, welcome.
Thank you so much, Meredith, and thank you to Queen's and the Institute for Sustainable Finance for inviting me for this really important topic, particularly during National Indigenous History Month.
Great, thank you for mentioning that. Okay, with that, what I'm going to do is disappear. The floor is yours, and I will join you at the end when we'll do Q&A with the audience.
Perfect. I'm just going to share my screen here so folks can see a presentation that I will walk through. And while I'm doing that, I will note that I'm joining you today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation, also known as Ottawa. So thank you again for welcoming me. Today's presentation really is focused on economic reconciliation. And in order to get to economic reconciliation, I think it's really important that we spend a bit of time setting the stage and setting the context to enlighten participants and those who have joined us today on, a bit of the history of Indigenous communities across Canada, talk to you a little bit about the diversity across Indigenous populations, give you a bit of some indicators around socioeconomic challenges and opportunities, lead you in through a bit of the legal context with Section 35 of the Constitution Act, along with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which really have helped to pivot Canada and North America for that matter, but in the Canadian context to focus on the truth and reconciliation and the calls to action that were published a number of years ago, and that did have a call out for businesses in Canada in terms of the role that they can play in reconciliation. So just to start at a high level, the Indigenous population in Canada exists from coast to coast to coast. It is continuing to grow at the fastest pace of all populations across Canada. The 2021 census had almost 2 million people identifying as Indigenous, either First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, and that accounts for about 5% of the population. This growth is continuing to, the population is continuing to grow in an upward trajectory as well. The population is diverse. So there's about 633 First Nations across Canada, existing in all provinces, along with the territories of Northwest Territories and the Yukon. There are 4 Inuit regions that encompass the Arctic, which lead from the northern part of Northwest Territories, all of Nunavut, northern Quebec, and the northern part of Labrador. As well, there are 5 provincial Métis associations and regional Métis associations that exist from Ontario west to northern part of Alberta, northern part of British Columbia. There's over 70 Indigenous languages, which are, currently at the brink of extinction in many cases. And there is federal law now to try and protect Indigenous languages. There is a diverse and rich history, culture, norms, ceremonies from coast to coast to coast. And the Indigenous nations, and the 70 Indigenous languages that I just spoke about all encompass very, a variety of cultural and social norms. And so the diversity is pretty unique from coast to coast to coast. The average age is also about a decade younger than the non-Indigenous population, which really represents a significant opportunity for Canada and the economy. Canada is also made up of historic treaties, and these treaties go from parts of Quebec all the way through to the Yukon and Northwest Territories. These treaties encompass pre-Confederation treaties, such as the treaties of peace and friendship all the way on the East Coast, and coming across Canada to the more post-Confederation treaties and the numbered treaties. The Williams Treaty in Ontario is a large one encompassing all of sort of southern Ontario, and the numbered treaties extend all the way up to the Yukon. Modern day treaties, things that you may be aware of, like the creation of Nunavut, for example. There are modern day treaties mostly in BC and in the north. The James Bay and Northern Quebec Treaty is one that many folks are familiar with. Nunatsiavut is one of the latest treaties, which was settled in Northern Labrador, which is an Inuit land claim treaty that provides for rights around land access, resource access, and governance objectives as well. So governance around how they'll run their own governments in their territories, drawing down on things like education, governance over education, child welfare, and the like. Many people are familiar with the Nisga'a Treaty in a northern part of BC, as that one was settled in the late 90s. We'll get right into some socioeconomic indicators. I think this is something that's pretty important and significant, as participants will note. No matter where you are across the country, there are Indigenous populations and large Indigenous populations centered around urban centers. The chart here just demonstrates the high numbers of Indigenous people existing in Winnipeg, Edmonton, Vancouver, all the way to Victoria. The highest concentration of Indigenous people in an urban center is in Thunder Bay, Winnipeg, and Saskatoon, where you can find a variety of Indigenous people, predominantly First Nations, living in these urban centers. The average income for Indigenous people is also startling at 25% less than non-Indigenous workers and counterparts. Unemployment averages are high, and normally somewhere around double that of non-Indigenous participants. This could account for the large concentration in urban centers where there's high incidence of homelessness happening in the urban centers, but also in the far north and remote areas where jobs are harder to come by, and there's a large number of un- and underemployed Indigenous peoples, be they First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. Education is also improving, but still at a startling rate below non-Indigenous peoples. 9.8% of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have university degrees, compared to almost 30% of non-Indigenous population. So there's a lot of these socioeconomic indicators that look startling, look a little bit shocking, but they really do represent a significant opportunity for us as a country in different regions and in different industries to move the yardsticks when it comes to reconciliation. As we move over to the legal context, whether you're in the resource sector or, the energy sector, you'll note that most often folks are talking about still Section 35 of the Constitution Act and the duty to consult. I know it's near and dear to my heart and the work that I do at the Canada Infrastructure Bank, because when we make investments in infrastructure that cross and exist on traditional territories, we concern ourselves deeply with the impacts or the potential impacts that those projects might have on Aboriginal and treaty rights. And Section 35 of the Constitution Act really established the protection of those rights. And those are the protections of the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Indigenous people across Canada. And this leads really to a concentration of involvement and interest being expressed by Indigenous communities who are host to many projects, be they resource projects like a mine or a forestry operation, or an energy project like a transmission line or a pipeline going through their territory. In the legal context, the duty to consult is a requirement on behalf of the Crown, whether it's a federal Crown or a provincial government or territorial government, when they contemplate the activity might have, and it's a low bar, might have an impact on the rights of Indigenous people. And those rights could be rights that are enshrined in treaties, or they could be rights that are active Aboriginal rights. So the right to hunt, to gather, the right to protect some sacred sites that are not always easy to locate. And so it's really important that proponents and businesses who are operating across traditional territory are working closely with Indigenous populations to understand what those rights are and how their activities might have an impact. Many Indigenous communities, particularly the further north you go, still use the land for hunting and trapping and guiding. And so they may have sort of a summer residence where their hunting or their fishing grounds might be located, and more of a winter residence where they may still participate in trapping and hunting. And so they need to be able to and are afforded the protection of those interests. And so we need to make sure that as we're conducting our businesses, we're understanding what the use of the land is and how our conduct might impact them. And that's why the Crown, federal, provincial, territorial crowns, are concerned themselves when they're providing environmental approvals and any regulatory approval on your projects. They may be concerning themselves deeply with the potential for impact on the Aboriginal rights or in the Aboriginal interests. And it's near and dear now to the hearts of most governments to make sure that they conduct themselves in accordance with not only the law, but the honor of the Crown, and thinking carefully about how those projects that they're approving might have an impact on the rights of Indigenous people. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is another a fundamental part of legislation. In May of 2016, Canada officially removed its objector status to the UN Declaration, and now it has been endorsed both by the federal government in Canada, but also by some provincial governments. For example, the British Columbia government is putting this first at the forefront of the work that they're doing across the territory. I think the most important piece of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the thing that stands out the most for businesses, is this concept of free, prior, informed consent, or also known as FPIC. FPIC is something that is actually not that dissimilar to the duty to consult. And so really the concept behind FPIC is that we want to make sure that Indigenous people are aware of the projects and the operations on their territory, and that they have an opportunity to voice their concerns and to voice their support for projects. Based on, frankly, the Act, the Declaration and the Act provides it's a guiding tool for Canada and for businesses and for Indigenous people to find a path to work together collectively, so that we can have more reparations of the relationship that has been tarnished for for so many years. And the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People is something that is global in nature and really protects the sovereignty, protects the dignity and the well-being of Indigenous peoples around the world and globally. My advice to many is to pick up a copy of the Declaration and have a read. And it's not a scary document. It's actually something that, as Indigenous people worldwide and globally, are being afforded some protections and the acknowledgements that they have been here from time immemorial, and that they have interests not just in land but in socioeconomic benefits and participation and inclusion in the economy and in the societies for which they live. Big part of reconciliation these days has been has really been escalated in the Canadian consciousness, and this escalation happened really when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2008. Now, it took a number of years, but after many cross-country tours and discussions with communities, with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, the commission released its report in 2015 and it was really more of a call to action, 94 calls to action. This photograph is, I can see Marie Delorme the photo at the bottom of the page. Marie Delorme was one of the commissioners, Willie Littlechild, and Justice Sinclair, former Senator Sinclair, was the lead commissioner. The goal of the TRC was really to educate Canadians and unpack the legacy and the abysmal history of residential schools in Canada. It talks and it provides these calls to action as a roadmap for Canadian society to come to grips, first acknowledge the truth that these residential schools happened, that many children were taken from their homes and from their families and from their communities and put into schools away from home as youngsters, some as young as 2 and 3 years old, up till high school age children. They were brought to residential schools to quote unquote take the Indian out of the Indigenous person. And this was really done in a way to integrate Indigenous people into the broader Canadian society. Many kids didn't make it home. A couple of years ago at Kamloops First Nation, they discovered through some work that there were, 215 children buried at the residential school. And the Canadian government now is undertaking a lot of work to figure out how many other children were buried at their residential schools. And the numbers continue to grow, and they've surpassed over 2,000 right now. I actually don't have the latest data, but the numbers continue to grow with each residential school that they do this ground penetration research to figure out how many of the children are in unmarked graves. And you can just imagine the trauma that causes for families, for communities, the lack of trust between Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments is deeply rooted in the history of residential schools. And in order to move forward, the TRC released its calls to action in a way to find a path for a country like Canada to acknowledge the history and move forward in a collaborative and inclusive manner. So, one of the key pieces of the TRC that I like to quote is actually on this slide. Our country is already great, but how much greater will Canada be when every young person grows up learning that Indigenous cultures are not something to be looked down upon, but rather sources of inspiration and innovation. In the TRC, one section that I like to focus on is section 92. And I carry my little Bible. I'm not sure if you can see it, but this is my miniature version of the calls to action. And Section 92 really does call on corporate Canada to take some action. And those actions include things like, teaching your employees about Indigenous peoples. Cultural competency awareness is something critical. So to remove systemic barriers and systemic racism that still exists today. It talks about, consulting, as I mentioned earlier on the duty to consult, and it's a legal requirement, but it's also a good neighbor's behavior to consult and work with the local communities to build respectful relationships. It talks about ensuring that you're continuing to educate and update your staff, create this awareness, both on the rights and treaties where you're located, but also on things like the UN Declaration, and having a deeper understanding and appreciation for the struggles that so many Indigenous communities have gone through, but the opportunity of including them in your businesses. And I just think that the work of the TRC has been instrumental in opening up a safe space for dialogue within Indigenous peoples and among business people as well as educators to work together to find that path. Here is a slide that really outlines Section 92. I've read a couple of these pieces to you already. Access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector is something that will create sustainable long-term benefits, not just for Indigenous people, but frankly for corporate Canada. And we see this in my work today at the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We look for opportunities for procurement so that we can procure to Indigenous businesses, and we look at all the many types of ways that we can continue to train our staff and educate our people so that we go into each business transaction, whether it's with Indigenous communities or whether it's not. We ask the right questions and ensure that our borrowers and our partners can articulate the territory for which they're on, and that they understand the importance of that to the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And I think this is something that many other corporations and business leaders can be undertaking in a much more proactive approach. I want to talk now a little bit about the size of the Indigenous economy. And this is a dated map. So as you can see, the data here is from 2016, and it was done with some forecasts with TD Economics, as well as the Canada Council for Aboriginal Business. For a number of years, Indigenous people were seen as a net drain on the Canadian economy. So the Canada Council for Aboriginal Business and TD Economics decided to do a bit of a study to figure out, are Indigenous people actually a net drain on Canada's economy? And you'll likely have heard of a number of stereotypes around Indigenous peoples and the free education that all Indigenous peoples get. And every Indigenous person is tax-free, so they don't pay taxes. And so many Indigenous people are on social assistance. And so it's really a big cost to Canada. And the Canadian taxpayers. But in fact, the Aboriginal economy and the Indigenous economy has grown and continues to be projected to grow to greater than $1 billion. Right now, we know that as of 2016, these numbers were actually surpassed. That's on this document. So, the size of the Canadian economy, or the Indigenous economy in 2016, was projected to be around $35 million. It actually surpassed that. Indigenous people are entrepreneurial. There are over 5,000 small and medium-sized Indigenous businesses, everything from construction, transport, to financial institutions and investors. The Indigenous economy is vast, and it is made up of a lot of entrepreneurs. The Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, if you're interested, has published a number of research papers on the size of the Canadian economy. And most recently, the Indigenomics Institute, led by Caroline Hilton, has done a number of papers really focusing on the size of and the growth opportunity of the Indigenous economy. And as we see, and I don't know if you read today's Globe and Mail or yesterday's Globe and Mail, but the Arctic in particular is one area that's really quite untapped, both from a future. Today's article was all about the mining potential and the ability to use and capture the value so that we can actually transition to a clean economy much faster. But yesterday's article was really around northern defense and the opportunity to streamline and be systematic about the approach to developing infrastructure in the Arctic so that you both pair national defense with local communities and local economies so that we can continue to grow Canada's economy in the Arctic. So just as a sense of growth and potential, we know that many of the critical mineral mines that are going to be needed for that clean transition exist in more rural and northern remote communities and regions of this country, which really creates that opportunity, that swell for both enabling the right infrastructure that could support both your development, but also local communities. And you have as I said earlier, an under and unemployed population that could really benefit from the jobs and opportunities in the region. So the Indigenous economy and the Indigenous market is a growth market and a great opportunity to seize upon. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about economic inclusion and sustainability. We know that an economy that's inclusive of Indigenous peoples means that it's good for Canada. It's good for all of us in Canada. It includes things like business partnerships, where we see, and I see this often in my sector in the clean power space, where clean power developers or renewable power developers are looking at opportunities to partner with Indigenous communities, both because of skilled trades, but also because there's actually opportunities to include Indigenous wealth in projects and grow these partnerships and flourish. There's a great opportunity for building capacity at the Indigenous community level and growing the access to capital. We know that there's best practices and knowledge that's held at the local community that may not be held by the developer. And often when developers are looking at building out their projects, they start off with desktop studies as to where they'll locate. When you're involving Indigenous communities and including Indigenous communities early in the process, you actually have the opportunity then to grow your own knowledge base and avoid pitfalls on the land. You certainly don't want to be crossing burial sites and sacred sites, because that can cause a lot of delays and major cost overruns. So when you're including Indigenous populations, local Indigenous populations in business decisions early, it means that you end up usually with a much better project on time and often on budget as well. And it means that Indigenous populations can benefit from, economic inclusion, business inclusion. That's jobs. That's as investors. It's helping with the trade and the network connections to local procurement opportunities. I just want to say that is the main end of this presentation. I might have whipped through it a little bit faster than intended, but I see that there's a number of questions already in the Q&A box. And so I'm going to see if Meredith wants to join in.
I'm here. Yes. So I'll ask you, Hillary, to stop sharing your screen. If you don't mind. There we go. So we're back. A question just came in that I want to put to you first, because I think it'll give us some context, which is, can you tell us about some of the economic reconciliation projects that the Canada Infrastructure Bank has invested in? Specifically, we've got a projects per year, money per year. Can you give us some details about the kind of specific work you guys are doing?
Sure. So we have a number of streams that are focused really on economic reconciliation, inclusion of Indigenous populations. So one example, there was a great publication yesterday from the Narwhal on the Oneida Battery Storage Park. And so this is a project where a battery storage company, NR Store, led by Annette Verschuren, decided, they wanted to build a large battery storage park in southwestern Ontario, and that, they thought the best way to do this would be in partnership with an Indigenous community. And so they looked at the territory and said, Six Nations of the Grand River is the closest community, and thought, let's have a discussion before we start locating where the project would go. And it was more of a, very early conversation. And so they've worked in partnership now for the last few years to develop a project that now has blossomed into, it's got a contract, it is fully financed, and the CIB played a significant role in working closely with NR Store and Six Nations to actually bring on other financial partners, because this is one of the largest battery storage facilities in Canada. And so we helped both with through some advisory work to get this project to a place where it was financeable, and to negotiate contracts with the province for, offtake agreements. And, it's just remarkable because that project will enable jobs and participation of the local people of Six Nations of the Grand River, but they've also made an investment in the project, and they brought in another financial and energy partner with Northland Power. And so together they've been able to create the access to capital so that Six Nations can be an investor in the project and will yield returns, long-term revenues and stable revenue for the community to reinvest in more economic development, to reinvest in their own people. And so that's one of the ways that we do it on our large projects, where we will, we ask the question up front when a potential borrower comes to us, are you partnering with any Indigenous communities? And if they say no, we always ask why. So that's one way we do it. But the other way we do it is through, smaller projects. So our typical investments are meant to be these large, multi-million dollar, hundreds of $1 million projects. But what that did was, and we recognized that left out smaller Indigenous communities who also have large infrastructure gaps locally in their own communities. And so we created the Indigenous Community Infrastructure Initiative so that we could invest in smaller projects where Indigenous populations can help start closing their own infrastructure gaps through concessionary financing, low-cost loans from the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And we've done that on a number of projects now. The first one was actually a really interesting project called the Chouetten Rail Project. And this is a railway up the northeastern part of Quebec into Labrador. So the railway serves 3 Innu communities, and it's a major transportation hub for them to get goods and services into the communities up in this remote region of northern Quebec. But it also enables them to create additional income through serving mining loads up in the iron ore space of Labrador. And so we were able to make an investment in that community's project because they needed to do some major rail upgrades, add some major safety features and stations. And so we were able to make a significant investment alongside the Indigenous partners to really build up and modernize that rail system so that their community members could get better transportation route and more safe transportation route, but also they could increase volumes of iron ore coming down to the ports in Quebec. And so those are the types of investments we're doing right now. And it's really creating that swell of independence for communities, and it's enabling the access to affordable capital for communities, which can sometimes be quite challenging when they're looking at traditional financial institutions and lenders.
Got it. And do you have a sense sort of how many projects you guys are supporting at any one time, or is that changing all the time?
So it does it fluctuates quite frequently, but on major linear projects, most of them will have Indigenous partners. And in the smaller Indigenous community, we're targeting $1 billion, and we have a pipeline in excess of $1 billion right now of investments for the smaller Indigenous communities. And so $1 billion is a target; it's a floor, not a ceiling. And so we were trying to see whether or not there would be a lot of uptake on this. And so certainly, we're targeting to close 5 deals a year, and I suspect we'll be in excess of those targets, and we should be looking at increasing them. But the bank is fairly young still. Our first employees were hired in 2018, and the Indigenous initiative just started 2 years ago. So yeah, I think we're certainly seeing the growth, and as more Indigenous communities and project partners realize that there's capital available to include Indigenous communities, they're approaching us more and more. And we're certainly seeing that now in the clean fuel space, any energy transition space, and most of the trade and transport, any kind of linear asset. That's where, they're seeing much more potential for impacts on territory and interest of communities. And communities have been saying they want to be included in the economic engine of Canada for a number of years, and the Canada Infrastructure Bank certainly enables that through our programs and initiatives.
Right. Okay. Wow. That's a lot of information. Thank you, Hillary. There's a lot of questions coming in too, and some of them are very specific. So I'm just going to try to throw a few at you. This one's more general, and I think an important one. So in your opinion, how is corporate Canada doing in Call to Action 92? So this person writes, I certainly see the education and inclusion of Indigenous communities in my company, which is oil production in Alberta, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as we consider companies across Canada.
So I can say that in the last 10 years, it's a remarkable improvement. So, and it goes beyond land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements are important, especially when you think through like who was on the land before you. And some companies are still at land acknowledgements. But I'm seeing a large trajectory, and certainly I think the federal government's new legislation around procurement, 5% procurement for Indigenous businesses, has helped. The TRC also helped. And then, and I hate to say it, but I think the tragedy of the real recognition, people can grapple with the 215 children that were found at the Kamloops, like that rose the consciousness of Canadians and Canadian businesses. And so I also think duty to consult and the number of cases that companies and jurisdictions have lost because they didn't meet the basic tenets of meeting consultation obligations under our Constitution Act have made businesses aware that they need to do more. And let's avoid these delays that we don't win in court. Let's avoid that. And partnerships actually can be lead to a lot of great fruit, for lack of a better word. And so I think that companies are doing a great job. I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more Indigenous people on corporate boards. That's still an abysmally low number. And so that translates into a values piece and a governance piece and awareness at the corporate. I'd like to see more Indigenous people in executive roles in corporate Canada. And so that's a little bit slower. But we are seeing investments across procurement opportunities, particularly to the point of the person asking the question in the oil and gas sector. We see a lot of contracts being let to Indigenous businesses throughout Alberta and Canada. And certainly the opportunity for partnership is ripe. Most of the borrowers that come in the clean transition space are certainly saying, we have Indigenous partners. And how can you help us help them to get access to affordable capital to make investments? So I think I'm certainly seeing a lot of growth but also a bright future ahead. And as we see more and more Indigenous people, trained in governance and corporate leadership, we'll start seeing more capacity for those board positions and executive roles.
Right. That's great that you feel optimistic. Are there any sort of one or two sort of points you could suggest, like if people are listening and they're like, okay, I want to do something. I want to do something at our company now. I mean, are there things short of recruiting more Indigenous members to boards? Are there kind of takeaways that people could implement right away?
Yeah, I think we often are now looking at our own employees and saying, okay, who's in my employee base? If the Indigenous population in Canada is 5%, do I have 5% of my employees that are Indigenous? And if not, have I started recruiting? Because if you don't start recruiting for even your own employee base, or you start looking for Indigenous employees, you won't get them because they may not fall into, they might not fit within the mold of a particular role. And so you have to actually start looking for Indigenous employees. And education levels are going up, and certainly if it's in the trades or the skilled labor market, a lot of Indigenous employees. But I see more and more Indigenous students in MBA programs, and there's over 2,000 Indigenous lawyers in this country, and physicians, over 1,000 Indigenous physicians. So when you start seeing in the professions, I'd love to see more students in engineering and certainly the STEM space, but they do exist. And so sometimes it just takes a hard look. One good example is, through our own procurement initiatives under Indigenous, when we're hiring law firms, we always look for law firms that have Indigenous partners, because that's one way that they can stand out. One of the law firms has continued to bid in on some of our deals and wasn't successful because they don't have an Indigenous partner. In fact, they couldn't identify an Indigenous lawyer at their firm. And so when I had a conversation with them on the side, they the light bulb went on. And so they went out and they looked at their summer interns, their article students. And they thought, why don't we have Indigenous articles? And it's because their credentials are so high and they don't really recognize the value and the hardships that so many Indigenous students have had to get into law school, let alone to, get the very top grades to get onto the Bay Street law firm for their articles. And so they made some adjustments as to how they started thinking about those law students coming in. And that resulted in them now having a number of Indigenous interns, which will then hopefully lead to Indigenous lawyers at the firm and future partners. So we have to start somewhere. And I think, just looking in-house to see whether or not there are, we are also looking at, dedicating a space in our offices. And so there's things that we can do, and working with the local community to make sure that if you can connect with an elder in the local community to do a lunch and learn session, or a local Indigenous business person to do a lunch and learn, anything to kind of build awareness and educate your workforce is always going to be positive and lead to positive outcomes.
Right. Okay. That's important. Thanks for those suggestions. This question is, what are the main challenges, in your opinion, that Indigenous communities face when trying to get access to capital for their own development or infrastructure projects? Are there areas in which you think the academic community could work with these communities to support them? I'm imagining that this questioner is perhaps in the academic world and wanting to know how to lend a hand. But the first part of the question, I think, is important. What are those main challenges Indigenous communities are facing trying to get access to capital?
So I personally believe, and this is not a CIB response, this is Hillary Thatcher, and both based on my experience, I think there still are a lot of systemic barriers. First Nations in particular. So First Nations are distinct from Métis and Inuit. First Nations have reserve lands. Métis and Inuit don't. And reserve lands are federal lands. And I think that because of the lack of Indigenous ownership of the reserves, and that those are federal lands, they can't pledge land, and nobody can take security in their lands. And so banks and other lenders see Indigenous communities as risky because they can't pledge collateral on reserve. And so and that security piece is very challenging. And so that's one part of systemic barriers, but there's others. Indigenous communities, 10 years ago, you wouldn't be reading in the Globe and Mail about the positive opportunities. You wouldn't be reading about the partnerships that you were seeing today, and about an Indigenous infrastructure fund being let, and that was yesterday's article. So you wouldn't be seeing these positive articles. They were more negative articles. It was always about a corrupt chief, and I think there was corruption in communities, and all these other things. And so I think that those barriers also, and the truths, need to be unpacked, because at the end of the day, these are governments, not unlike municipal governments. In fact, they often have more powers than municipal governments and more jurisdiction, particularly where there's modern treaties. And so these are governments that use funds to provide services and to their members. So I think, banks and lenders need to recognize that lending and working with Indigenous communities isn't actually as risky as they may once have thought. And in fact, the loan losses for Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, is far less than that of non-Indigenous communities. And this is significant. And it just shows, I had a conversation recently with a colleague from a lender, and he said that that's because our risk appetite is different for Indigenous. And we, we don't give out and we don't lend nearly to the extent to Indigenous communities and companies as we do to non, because we just all automatically deem them very risky. And that's why we're not seeing any loan losses. And so we need to be like, that's our job as lenders, to do a bit, lean in a bit more and figure out like, what's that risk appetite? Can we go a bit further? And so from an academic perspective, I think there's a lot of things that academia could do to help that, to colleges, universities are bodies where a lot of research can be developed and underpinned to actually start shifting behaviors. And so I think the shift in behavior happens when institutions, lending institutions, see the facts in front of them and recognize that this actually they're losing opportunities for market growth, and there's a market here that's quite untapped. And so I think that's something that academic institutions can certainly lend a hand at demystifying some of these these systemic barriers that exist. And I will say it's predominantly in First Nations, and it's because of that reserve base. But at the end of the day, First Nations will continue to be funded as other governments. Instead of an equalization payment like a province or territory, they get their federal transfers annually, and it's pretty guaranteed income that continues to revolve so they can deliver the programs and services. So it's not that dissimilar.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a lot of questions, and a lot of them are quite specific, but I want to put this one to you, and I don't know if you can answer, and do your best. This person's writing, I'm hoping to get information about whether water sustainability and clean water sources are still concerns for First Nations communities. If a Canadian business has a potential solution for this or other issues, how can we get in touch with communities? Are there government programs or contacts a business can reach out to make it to make an impact? I guess what people are wondering is, okay, I'm over here with my idea. I know there are groups out there that need help. I mean, I don't know that the Canadian Infrastructure Bank is exactly the conduit to connect the two, but do you have advice for how we can bring these populations together?
Yeah, I do. So, and I think because I have a lot of government experience, I kind of know that there is still a crisis in clean drinking water in Canada, in particular with First Nations, but also with Inuit communities. So you may have read about the Iqaluit water systems last year, and it continues to be a key concern for all of Nunavut. And my advice is, if you have a technology or solution, the first place I'd go to is to the local community that you're close to. And if it's not a community that is on a boil water advisory or a long-term boil water advisory, there's short and long-term ones. They're all a terrible situation to find yourself in. If you go to the Indigenous Services Canada website, they actually have a map that locates all of the long-term boil water advisories, and figure out if there's a community close to you that you can, and even if it's not close to you, start picking up the phone. You can find, First Nations phone numbers easily, and I would just start calling their infrastructure or their works department, and they'll be able to talk to you and figure out if there's an opportunity here for some partnership so that you can actually trial some of these things. And that's maybe another place for academia to come in. There's lots of really smart engineers and developers who can take a technology and then figure out how to apply it in a real live situation. And so it's a bit of a test case, but there's no time like the present to try and alleviate some of these boil water advisories. And the Indigenous Services Canada has grant funding to actually help to move projects forward a bit faster. So we have done wastewater. We're looking at some water systems as well, but those are technology proven for community-based assets. So if there is an Indigenous partner that you're looking at and you want to see somebody make a loan to get that project off the ground, certainly we could come at the time when there's an actual project that's being proposed.
Okay, and I suppose this applies outside of water as well, so other sectors.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay. There are a bunch of questions here, Hillary, and I'm going to try to kind of group them into one. People have noted the kind of colonial lens through which we're still looking at these issues. Even at the beginning of your presentation, someone said, I feel like this is kind of a colonial take on these issues. We have other people asking things like, In our efforts to include Indigenous voices in the execution of events and participation in the process, we do hear that the governance approach is white-based and we should consider alternate approaches. Is there an appropriate way to address this issue? I guess what I think people, I feel like, are sort of trying to get at is how do we balance the colonial nature of the system in which we're operating, but also needing to make changes, needing to bring in other ways of being and doing. How do you propose that we balance these many needs in this economic space?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, we've just undertaken some research on Indigenous impact. So we're an impact investor at the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and we know that, you know, the impacts of an investment in an Indigenous community can't be measured the same way as an impact, the way that we would typically measure impacts in the rest of the Canadian context. So, for example, when we invest in a clean power project in Canada, like Oneida, for example, and take away Six Nations, but we're making a large investment in this large energy transition project. We're looking at, you know, GHGs per dollar spent. Like, we really want to get more GHGs reduced in this country, and so we're trying to figure out what's that balance per dollar spent. In a specific Indigenous context, we recognize that if I put in, you know, offset diesel in a small remote Inuit community, it's going to cost a lot of money, and the reduction in GHGs is small. So I would never be able to make those investments if those are the impacts I'm seeking. But also, when I talk to the Indigenous community, frankly, when I talk to the rest of Canada, but when I talk to the Indigenous community in particular, and I say, "Well, we want to reduce GHGs," they say, "What are you talking about?" Like, they want to get rid of noise in their community. They want to reduce childhood asthma in their community. They want to actually be they don't want to be buying fuel anymore in these remote locations. They want to be energy independent in those. And so the impacts are quite different. And we need to think through our narrative when we're working with Indigenous communities as to what's important, what are the impacts that they're seeking, and then is there a way to track the impacts? And frankly, I think that's, again, to be less colonial means to put it into the Indigenous community's hands to determine what are the impacts that they're seeking, and how do they want to monitor them, and do they want to report them? And if they don't, we should be okay with that. And so I think that goes, you know, there's a concept, and actually a professor out of Queens, Shira Barberstock, has done a lot of work on this, but on innovation. But, you know, there's this concept called two-eyed seeing, and two-eyed seeing is basically when you're in the Canadian economy and you're working with institutions that are regulated, financial institutions and universities, like there's a real balancing act that we have to play. And so, you know, and I will apologize because that's innate in me for if the presentation seemed too colonial up front. Really, it's about an education. Like, the reality is we're a land of treaties and a long history of oppression of Indigenous people. And I think people need to know that, and they need to know the legal construct for which we operate. But we also need to find that balance. And two-eyed seeing is really about, you know, in a place where, you know, you are like regulated, but you're trying to work with Indigenous communities. How do we bring in those values into our projects, and how do we bring in those values into the way we interact with community? And it will be different based on the communities you're working with. And you find yourself all over the spectrum. And so I think we take guidance from the communities that we work with. And I'll give you one more example on impacts, and it was really around a clean power project in Alberta that we're working on, where we talked closely. We always talk to the chief and the council and their economic development corporation to understand, why do you want to be a partner on this clean power project? And it's not for the same reason that the non-Indigenous developer is in it. They're in it for returns. They're in it for, like, you know, they want to shift for sustainability reasons out of the oil and gas sector and show that they're balancing their portfolio with some clean power because it's good for their, you know, it's probably good for their reputation. The Indigenous community talked to us specifically about the fact that their workers have been in the oil and gas sector for the last number of decades, and they all want to transition out. And so they need to find jobs in the clean power space. And so if the community owns a clean power project, that affords their community members opportunities to transition the skilled labor and their skills into the clean power space, which aligns with their values. And so when we think about the impacts, like, and they actually want to track and see whether or not there's an opportunity here to see how many people leave the fossil fuel sector and come into a clean power, the clean power trades. So just a very different set of, and they're an investor in the project, but they're not talking about returns. That's like certainly something on their radar, but it's not like at the top of their priorities. So it is a challenging place to be, but it's really about figuring out how to create that balance. And some folks refer to it as two-eyed seeing, and being able to sort of understand both sides and being able to see the value that both sides offer and how that really creates a stronger outcome at the end of the day for all of us.
Right. I guess we forget
Reconciliation.
I guess we forget how much growth we've actually seen in such a short time in terms of our own perspectives.
Yeah.
And so we're still trying to figure it out. Like, how do you balance the various needs?
Yeah.
A question from Heather: can you speak to the challenges and opportunities with engaging the urban Indigenous population, particularly relating to representation on boards and agencies? What are some things organizations can do to remove barriers to engagement? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, you know, and the urban population is, I mean, it's diverse as well. So, you know, there's a lot of professional Indigenous people who live in urban centers because that's where the big jobs are, at the law firms, at the banks, and engineering firms, et cetera. And then you have a lot of Indigenous people who also are, you know, struggle in the urban centers and can't get jobs, and they come down with the hopes of living in Toronto and being able to like and get an apartment and get a job, and it just doesn't come to fruition, and then they end up in a very difficult situation. So my best advice again is, you know, there are programs across the country, and in fact, you know, and I'm not here to promote any programs, but like the ICD, for example, the Institute of Corporate Directors, they put out their like list of all the graduates every couple of months of their cohorts. And I'm seeing more Indigenous people graduating from that. And those are professional people, they're engineers, they're doctors, there's a lot of Indigenous lawyers. And so there's, you know, tapping into that resource. In fact, recently the Institute put out an Indigenous specific training program. And so that should yield even more Indigenous professionals who have that ability and who have the skill sets that so many of the boards of Corporate Canada and executive searches are looking for any talent pool, so that you know, you have the governance experience. I think just working your networks, going to events. There's, as I mentioned them earlier, the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business is a great group, and they host events across the country. And really try to promote, you know, Indigenous businesses. And so there's, you know, looking at where, if you're not already involved in networking at Indigenous sort of symposiums, and depending on the sort of area of work that you're in, you know, there's different organizations that host events, and it's a great way to build your networks and see what the talent pool actually looks like. So those are just a couple of examples.
No, actually, that seems like a really important place to leave it. So there are, I mean, Andy, do you want any sort of final closing thoughts? Like, those are useful takeaways that I think people can implement now. Anything else, like as we go off into our days and back to work, about what we should be thinking about? You've got 1 minute.
Yeah, so the biggest thing I think that we can all be doing is continuing to do cultural awareness, cultural competency training in-house in your organizations, and then thinking about, you know, what are the barriers for Indigenous people to be included in your business? And if there are barriers because you need to have the top grades in your engineering program, what can you do to innovate and think differently about the values that Indigenous people bring to the table? And that, because they bring a different set of values, and not just cultural values, but their experiences are so different. Indigenous people are among them, and I might be a bit biased here, among the most resilient people. They are still here, despite the efforts of Canada to extinguish a population. They are still here, and they continue to grow in strength and in the academic accolades. And so think about, you know, what are the barriers that are preventing them from getting into your corporate headquarters, and how do you remove some of those barriers, and how do you test the waters to see whether or not you can create an environment that's inclusive and that welcomes Indigenous people and supports them through that transition into corporate Canada.
Right, that's important to remember. Thanks, Hillary. I want to remind our audience, you're going to all be getting a copy of today's presentation. In that presentation earlier in the slides, we did see those the 92, the number 92 call to action around specific things that businesses can be doing to foster economic reconciliation. So keep your eyes on your inbox for that. I will note that you're only going to have access this time to the presentation for a couple of weeks. So share it broadly, and then it will poof, disappear. So take advantage while you can. I do want to wrap up today's session by letting all of you know about learning opportunities currently available through Queen's Executive Education. We've got lots of sessions coming up in the next few months, particularly in the fall and winter, so you can plan ahead. These are virtual and in-person sessions in everything from accounting to finance, accounting and finance fundamentals to developing your leadership presence. Visit smithqueens.com/execed for the full lineup of courses. And finally, this is the moment I let you know this is it for the summer. We're going to be taking a break on our webinars until the summer. So Hillary, you are our final presenter, and weren't you a spectacular one? So thank you. Keep your eyes on your inbox again for more info as we get closer to the end of the summer about what will be coming up in September. In the meantime, there is lots of learning to be had on the Smith Business Insight website. We've got articles, podcasts, recorded webinars, lots of stuff to keep you learning and stimulated all summer. smith.queensu.ca/insight for that. Hillary, pop back on a second, turn your camera on, give us a wave. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. There you are. We really have learned a lot, so I really appreciate your time today. And to our audience, thank you for your fantastic questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but we did our best. It's great to have you so engaged in this material. So thanks again for tuning in. Everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.